What if I told you that everything you think you know about evil is wrong? The serpent in the Garden of Eden, the rebellious angel cast from heaven, the ultimate deceiver who tempts humanity into darkness. We've heard this story 1,000 times, right? But here's the thing that nobody talks about. When you actually read the book of Genesis, when you look at what's written there versus what appears in the New Testament, you find something shocking. The serpent isn't called Satan. It's not identified as the devil. It's just a serpent, a crafty animal that could talk. So where did this entire mythology come from? How did a talking snake transform into the cosmic embodiment of evil itself? And more importantly, what does this transformation tell us about how humans create and understand the concept of evil? Let's start at the very beginning. Genesis chapter 3. You know the scene. The Garden of Eden, paradise on earth, Adam and Eve living in perfect harmony with God and nature. Then the serpent shows up. Now here's what the text actually says. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. That's it. It's described as crafty, as clever, as one of the animals God created. There's no mention of this being a fallen angel. No reference to Satan. No cosmic battle between good and evil. It's literally just introduced as a smart animal. The serpent approaches Eve and asks her about the trees in the garden. It's a conversation, almost casual. The serpent says, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Eve corrects this, explaining that they can eat from any tree except the one in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And here's where it gets interesting. The serpent tells Eve, "You will not certainly die. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now pause for a second. Is the serpent lying? That's what we've been taught, right? The serpent is the father of lies, the great deceiver. But look at what actually happens. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. Do they die immediately? No. Their eyes are open. They do gain knowledge of good and evil. They become, in some way, more like God. God himself confirms this later in Genesis when he says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil." So the serpent was actually telling the truth. Strange, isn't it? What the serpent doesn't mention is the consequence. The separation from God, the expulsion from paradise, the introduction of shame, pain, and mortality. But technically speaking, the serpent's words were accurate. This is so different from how we think about this story. We imagine the serpent as pure evil, lying to trick innocent humans. But the text presents something more complex, more ambiguous. After Adam and Eve eat the fruit, God curses the serpent. "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." This is interesting because it implies the serpent didn't always crawl on its belly. It suggests a transformation, a punishment. But again, there's no mention of this being Satan, no reference to a spiritual being, just an animal being cursed to a degraded physical state. God also says there will be enmity between the serpent and the woman, between their offspring. Some interpret this as the first prophecy of Christ, the one who will crush the serpent's head. But in the immediate context of Genesis, it simply explains why humans and snakes don't get along, why we instinctively fear them, and they strike at us. It's an etiological myth, a story that explains the origin of natural phenomena. Now let's jump forward, way forward, to the New Testament, written over 1,000 years after Genesis. Suddenly, the serpent has a new identity. In the book of Revelation, we read about that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. The connection is made explicit. The serpent equals Satan equals the devil. This is the interpretation that Christianity adheres to, which becomes doctrine, shaping the Western understanding of evil for 2 millennia. The Apostle Paul writes about Satan as a real, active spiritual entity. Jesus himself refers to Satan, speaking of seeing Satan fall from heaven like lightning. The New Testament is full of demonic activity, spiritual warfare, and the forces of darkness battling against the light of God. And retrospectively, the serpent in Genesis gets pulled into this narrative. It becomes the origin story of the devil himself. But here's the critical question. Is this reading back later theology into an earlier text? Is the New Testament imposing a framework onto Genesis that wasn't originally there? Most modern biblical scholars would say yes. The ancient Israelites who wrote and first read Genesis didn't have a concept of Satan as we understand it. They didn't have this dualistic view of cosmic good versus cosmic evil. That developed much later, influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism, through the experiences of exile and suffering, as well as centuries of theological evolution. In early Hebrew thought, evil wasn't a separate force opposed to God. Everything came from God, including what we might call evil. There's a passage in Isaiah where God says, "I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things." That's a very different worldview from the one Christianity inherits, where Satan is the source of evil and God is only good. The word Satan in Hebrew originally just meant adversary or accuser. It appears in the book of Job, but even there, Satan is part of God's court, one of the heavenly beings who serves God by testing humans. He's not rebelling against God, he's working for God. It's only in later Jewish and Christian theology that Satan becomes the rebellious angel, the enemy of God, the prince of darkness. So what happened? How did we get from a talking snake in a garden to the cosmic embodiment of evil? The answer tells us something profound about human nature and how we understand morality. As human societies became more complex, as Judaism and then Christianity spread across different cultures, and as people grappled with the problem of suffering and injustice, they needed a way to explain evil. If God is all good and all-powerful, why do bad things happen? Why is there suffering? Why do people do terrible things? One answer is to say that evil has its own source, its own power, that there's a cosmic battle happening, and we're caught in the middle. This is psychologically satisfying in many ways. It externalizes evil, gives it a face, a name, and an enemy to fight against. It also absolves humans of some responsibility. We're not evil, we're tempted by evil. We're victims of demonic influence. The serpent becomes the perfect symbol for this. Snakes are already frightening to most people, already associated with danger and death because of their venom. They move in this alien way, close to the ground, appearing suddenly. Many cultures have myths about serpents as tricksters or dangers. So transforming the Genesis serpent into Satan works on a primal, symbolic level. It takes our natural fear and gives it metaphysical significance. But there's something we lose in this transformation: the moral complexity of the original story. Because if we read Genesis without the lens of later theology, what we see is more ambiguous. We see humans making a choice, exercising free will, and desiring knowledge even at a cost. We see a God who places temptation right in the middle of paradise and then punishes his creations for succumbing to it. We see a serpent who tells an uncomfortable truth that God would have preferred to remain hidden. None of this means the serpent is good or that disobedience to God is right. But it does mean that evil, temptation, and moral failure are more complicated than a simple story of demonic deception. The serpent in Genesis represents something internal to the human experience, the voice that questions, that doubts, that wants what is forbidden. Making it into an external demon named Satan is a way of distancing ourselves from that voice, pretending it comes from outside rather than from within. Think about how we use Satan or the devil in everyday language. The devil made me do it. It's a way of avoiding responsibility. We externalize temptation, make it something that happens to us rather than something that arises from our own desires and choices. This can be comforting, but it's also a form of self-deception. The most dangerous evils in human history haven't come from people who thought they were serving the devil. They've come from people who thought they were serving the good, who convinced themselves that their cruelty was righteous, their violence necessary. The New Testament's interpretation of the serpent as Satan creates a framework for understanding evil that has shaped Western civilization. It gives us the concept of spiritual warfare, of possession and exorcism, of holy crusades against demonic forces. It divides the world into children of light and children of darkness. This framework has inspired great art, literature, theology, and philosophy. But it's also been used to justify terrible things. Witch hunts, inquisitions, religious wars. When you believe your enemies are literally agents of Satan, any cruelty becomes justifiable. Compare this to the Eastern philosophical traditions that don't have a concept of absolute evil. In Buddhism, there's no devil figure. There's ignorance, attachment, suffering, but not cosmic evil. In Taoism, there's a balance between yin and yang, not warfare between good and evil. These traditions often have a more nuanced view of human nature, seeing the capacity for both wisdom and foolishness, compassion and cruelty, as inherent in all of us. The enemy isn't external, it's our own unenlightened state. What's fascinating is that even within Christianity, there have always been voices questioning this dualistic framework. Early Christian mystics talked about the devil as a symbol rather than a literal being. Some theologians argued that evil has no real existence, that it's merely the absence of good, like darkness is the absence of light. Others pointed out that obsessive focus on Satan and demons can become a form of idolatry, giving too much power and attention to the forces of darkness. In modern times, many progressive Christians read the serpent story symbolically. The serpent represents the human ego, our desire for autonomy from God, our wish to determine good and evil for ourselves rather than accepting divine authority. The fall isn't about a literal fruit and a talking snake. It's about the human condition, our separation from the sacred, our exile into self-consciousness and mortality. This reading doesn't require believing in a literal Satan, but it still finds deep meaning in the story. But the traditional interpretation persists powerfully. Go to many churches today, and you'll hear sermons about spiritual warfare, about Satan prowling like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. You'll hear about demons and possession, about the devil's schemes and strategies. For millions of believers, Satan is as real as God, and the battle between them defines human history and individual lives. So who's right? Is the serpent in Genesis really Satan, or is that a later interpretation imposed on the text? Well, it depends on what you mean by really. If you're a biblical literalist who believes every word of Scripture is divinely inspired and without error, then yes, the New Testament's identification of the serpent with Satan must be correct, and that meaning was there all along, even if not explicitly stated. But if you approach the Bible as a collection of texts written by humans at different times with different understandings of God and the world, then no, the original meaning of the Genesis serpent story didn't include Satan as a cosmic evil being. What's more interesting than determining which interpretation is correct is asking what this evolution tells us about humanity. It reveals how our understanding of evil changes, how we project our fears and experiences onto ancient texts, how we use mythology to make sense of the darkness in the world and in ourselves. The transformation of the serpent into Satan reflects humanity's growing sense of the power and mystery of evil, our need to name it, to embody it, to fight against it. The Genesis story in its original form presents a world where evil, or at least moral failing, is intimate, domestic, almost casual. A conversation in a garden, a piece of fruit, a choice made in a moment. It's the evil of everyday life, the small temptations and rationalizations that lead us astray. The New Testament's Satan is something grander and more terrifying. Cosmic rebellion, eternal damnation, spiritual warfare on a universal scale. It reflects a world that had seen more suffering, more injustice, more seemingly inexplicable evil, and needed a bigger explanation. Neither version fully captures the mystery of why humans do evil things. We're capable of such extraordinary kindness and such horrifying cruelty. We build hospitals and concentration camps. We write symphonies and drop bombs. We can sacrifice ourselves for strangers or murder our neighbors over differences of religion or tribe. How do we explain this? Is it because we're tempted by demons, or because we're animals with big brains and competing instincts, or because we're damaged by trauma and twisted by bad ideologies, or because we freely choose evil knowing it's wrong? Probably all of the above. Human evil is overdetermined. It has multiple causes operating at different levels. The serpent in Genesis and the Satan of the New Testament are both attempts to symbolize this reality, to give it a story we can tell ourselves. They're not meant to be scientific explanations, but mythological truths, ways of expressing in narrative form the human experience of temptation, sin, and moral failure. What's valuable in the original Genesis story is its simplicity and its focus on human responsibility. Adam and Eve make a choice. They can't really blame it all on the serpent, though they try. God holds them accountable. There's something honest about this. We are responsible for our choices, even when we're tempted, even when we're deceived, even when we're weak. The evil we do comes from us, not just from external forces. What's valuable in the New Testament's framework is its recognition that evil is bigger than individual bad choices. There are systems of oppression, structures of violence, powers and principalities, as Paul calls them, that shape our world and our options. We're born into a fallen world, a world already marked by sin and suffering. Our individual choices happen within that context. We need liberation, not just moral improvement, salvation, not just better decision-making. Satan, as a symbol, represents these larger forces that we struggle against. But here's what we must not do. We must not use the concept of evil, whether serpent or Satan, as an excuse to dehumanize others. History is littered with atrocities committed by people who convinced themselves their enemies were demonic, were agents of Satan, were irredeemably evil. Once you put someone in that category, anything becomes permissible. This is the greatest danger of demonology, not that it's false, but that it can be weaponized. The truth that both the Genesis serpent and the New Testament Satan point us toward is this. There is something in the world and in ourselves that draws us away from the good, that tempts us towards selfishness and cruelty and destruction. Call it what you will. It's real, it's powerful, and it must be resisted. But it's not more powerful than the forces of love, compassion, justice, and mercy. And it's never an excuse for abandoning our own moral responsibility. When you stand at a crossroads and face a choice between kindness and cruelty, honesty and deception, courage and cowardice, there's a voice that might whisper to you. Maybe it sounds like a serpent, subtle and crafty. Maybe it sounds like your own thoughts. Maybe it sounds perfectly reasonable, giving you good reasons why the easier path is actually the right one. That voice is as old as Eden, as present as this moment. What matters isn't what we call it. What matters is that we recognize it, resist it, and choose the good anyway. The serpent asked Eve, "Did God really say?" It's the question that begins every temptation. Did they really mean that? Is that rule really important? Are the consequences really that serious? Would it really be so wrong? These questions aren't always bad. Sometimes authority should be questioned. Sometimes rules should be examined. The serpent promised knowledge, and knowledge is valuable. But wisdom means knowing not just what we can do, but what we should do. Not just what is possible, but what is right. The New Testament adds another layer to this. It says that even when we want to do good, we find ourselves doing evil. That there's a war within us, that we're enslaved to sin, that we need grace and redemption because we can't save ourselves through willpower alone. This is a profound psychological insight. Many of us have experienced exactly this. The frustration of knowing what we should do but doing the opposite, of failing over and over despite our best intentions. Whether that's demonic influence or just the complexity of human nature is almost beside the point. What matters is finding a path to transformation. So where does this leave us? With a serpent that may or may not be Satan, with a story that may be literally true or symbolically true or just a story, with questions about the nature of evil that don't have easy answers. But maybe that's exactly where we should be. Maybe certainty about evil is dangerous, and ambiguity is wiser. Maybe the point isn't to solve the mystery, but to live with it thoughtfully, carefully, humbly. Here's what I think the comparative look at Genesis and the New Testament teaches us. Evil is both intimate and cosmic, both internal and external, both our responsibility and beyond our control. We need multiple ways of understanding it because it's multidimensional. The simple story of a serpent and a choice reminds us that evil often begins small, in a moment of temptation, in a rationalization we make. The grand narrative of Satan and spiritual warfare reminds us that we're part of something larger, that individual sins connect to systemic evils, that the battle for the good is real and consequential. What we must not do is use either framework to escape responsibility or to demonize others. We are moral agents, capable of choice, responsible for our actions. And we are also finite, flawed, in need of grace and help. We face real temptation and real evil, and we must resist both with all our strength. But we must do so with humility, knowing that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, including our own. The serpent in the garden, whether animal or angel, asked the first question that led to the first sin. But questions aren't evil. Doubt isn't evil. Desire for knowledge isn't evil. What we do with these things determines whether they lead us toward wisdom or toward destruction. The Genesis story doesn't end in the garden. Humanity is expelled but not destroyed. God makes clothes for Adam and Eve, a tender act of care even in judgment. The story continues, and so does the possibility of redemption. The New Testament picks up that thread and runs with it, telling the story of how God enters into human history to defeat evil from within, to take on Satan's power and break it through sacrifice and love. Whether you believe that literally or find it symbolically powerful, it's a story about hope, about the possibility that evil doesn't have the last word. So what do you think? Is the serpent Satan, or is that a later interpretation? Does it matter how we live our lives today? Is evil a force we're fighting against? Or is it something we're struggling with inside ourselves? Or is it both? How do you understand the darkness in the world and the darkness that sometimes rises in your own heart? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear how you wrestle with these ancient questions that somehow never stop being relevant. And if this exploration made you think, if it challenged your assumptions or gave you a new perspective, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps more people find these conversations. And subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep diving deep into the big questions, the ones that philosophy and religion and human experience all circle around, the ones that don't have easy answers but are worth asking anyway. Because in the end, maybe wisdom isn't about having all the answers. Maybe it's about asking better questions and living thoughtfully with the mystery. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.